All right, now it's time to gather and crunch data. And let me move my little video where it's not in the way. Okay, gather and crunch data. So the few that I want to make sure that you are aware of, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it's a good foundation to start with, is the MIT Living Wage Calculator, firms with federal contracts, and that's firms like History Associates, because they are a federal contractor. Things like their price sheet are public knowledge, which is why we'll be able to look at them in a moment. Look at government pay schedules. So this is often referenced a lot by higher ups and people who have been in our fields for a long time. When people who have not been in the field as long ask about how they can find out what they should be paid, many people point to the government pay schedules, and they are helpful. We will go over that, but we'll also go over why they are not the end all be all in terms of information. Next up is checking all the job boards. So I need a library job, archives gig, even the more general like monster.com, any sort of job board that will gather positions that are available and salaries that are there. Checking like Bureau of Labor Statistics and salary surveys from our field. All of those help provide data, real-time data, and real actual pay rates that are happening right now. And then, of course, for your particular position, you have your current pay information, your current position description. And then we want to try and gather position classifications from your institution, if they exist, and those of our peers, if they're willing to share. So this is a snapshot of the list, and now we're going to dig into them. So first up is the MIT Living Wage Calculator. And for this one, here's the link for it, and I will drop it in the chat. Here is a screenshot. This is for Multnomah County, Oregon. Multnomah County is where Portland, the most populous city, is in Oregon. And you'll see it breaks it down to what the minimum wage is for this county. Oregon is one of those states where for the more urban areas, there's a higher minimum wage versus rural areas. So for Multnomah County, minimum wage. And then it also has a living wage. And you can see this goes into if you're just a single adult, if you're two adults, it also goes into typical expenses. There's a lot of good information here. But to start with, so you don't get overwhelmed, you always want to make sure that when you are in the job hunting process, especially, and you're looking at jobs outside of your area, not only what the minimum wage is, but what the living wage is. And if there's a big difference, like there is here by a couple dollars, $4 an hour almost, that makes a difference, right? And especially when you're looking at positions like we do, where we have masters, a couple masters, maybe even a PhD, you should not be at the minimum wage level. You should not even be at the living wage level, though that should be the absolute minimum you accept. You should be several dollars over this. So this is an excellent first place to start, especially for those looking outside their area or new to the profession, to see what that bottom threshold is, because it's not just minimum wage. You need to know the living wage. All right. So remember I talked about federal contracts. History Associates, it has been a federal contractor for almost forever, at least the last 15 years since I've been in the industry. And GSA is, I think, the general schedules for federal contractors. They collect all the information. And this is a very long, ugly link that I'll put in the chat. But you can go and see, I think it's like a 20-page PDF that describes the services they offer, that describes what the position descriptions are essentially for these different classes. And so you can literally go in and see, okay, I think that I am archivist slash records manager level 3 because I've had however many years of experience that they stipulate. I have done the responsibilities that they have included. Therefore, if I were a federal contractor working for a firm, then I would hope to command $83.40 an hour. Now, when you're working for a firm, you don't get all of that for the hour. They take some of it. However, this is a great place to start once you know what that minimum threshold is to see what that maximum threshold is. Because if the organization that you are looking at applying for is looking for one of these levels of positions, this would be the rate they would have to pay if they went with an outside firm and contractor. Now, of course, because this is a outside contractor and for details that we'll get into a little later, this is going to be about 3 times as much as what you would expect an hourly rate to be for a traditional employment position. So you want to take whatever this hourly rate is, divide it by about 3, and then get that hourly rate that would be appropriate for a traditional level of employment with that level of experience and responsibilities. So hopefully that makes sense. We are going to go over this again. So if you don't get it right now, just hang on and we'll come back. Government pay schedules. So this is something that I referenced because when the issue of salary comes up and when new professionals ask more veteran professionals, how do I even figure out what I am worth? They usually point to government pay schedules because it is one of the few places that actually outline, other than the private firms, what the different levels of positions are. So we've got archivists, historians, and library series. And very similar to what we just saw for the history associates, it goes into what each of these have, what their qualifications are, what level of experience they need. It goes into the descriptions here, and then we'll go find the cost on the next slide. But it goes into nature of assignments, a lot of detail where you can really get a feel for what they are looking for when they're asking for that level of like head of archives, for example, versus archives technician, and what that level of pay would be if you had a government level job. Now, the reason why this is not entirely 100% helpful is because they are government pay schedules, and especially at the federal level, usually there is always a level of increase that happens every year, no matter what, with the asterisks of Congress needing to pass the budget every year, which makes things not fun for a while. But my point being, for many of you who are not in a government level job, especially not at the federal level, you don't necessarily have access to that level of funding. And so if you're in academia, if you are a private historical society, if you're a local community museum, obviously you're not commanding those same types of rates. And so this is something you need to keep in mind, that if you see someone in DC at the National Archives being paid $75,000 and you are also in DC but you're at a smaller historical society, while you should be making a good amount of money given your location and your job, it may not be the same amount as if you were a federal employee. So something to keep in mind. These are very helpful, but they're not the end all be all. So we looked at the descriptions on that first slide and link, and now we're going to move over to OPM, Office of Policy Management, I believe. And over here, we can get the pay schedules per locality, which is important because the pay schedule for an archivist 1420-10, for example, so a level 10 archivist, you could see the pay scale up here with the various steps, and steps are like years in the level 10, etc. It's going to vary between you being archivist level 10 in DC versus you being archivist 10 in, I pulled up Charlotte, North Carolina. So keep that in mind. And while you're looking at government schedules to get an idea, you can then also go over and make sure that you're pulling the government schedule, the pay schedule for your geographic location that you are looking at. So they have them alphabetically for almost every location you could imagine. Most of them go down to like city, major city, county level, get as close as you can. Fortunately, the 2021 schedule is already up. They usually, OPM tries to get these up a couple of months before the next year. So click on the PDF or open the link and check out your areas for the different levels of archivist, librarian, historian, and get a sense for what those salary ranges are. So that was government schedules. Now we are going to get into the salary surveys. And across the professions, there has been a real lack of consistent data gathering, which makes it really difficult for us to accurately calculate trends and do any sort of forecasting. But there is at least some information for us to use. Starting with museums first, the American Alliance of Museums is perhaps, in my opinion or observation, the most frequent one who does salary surveys. Their most recent, I believe, was 2017. So this is pre-COVID economic collapse. I'll be interested to see what the next one is. And they also link to various regions because, as we know, different regions have different costs of living and different institutional types available. So they've got theirs, but then they've also got links to related regions. Now, that is perhaps viewed as like an official survey. What is interesting is the grassroots sort of crowdsourcing surveys that have been happening across the LAM fields. This particular one is the Arts and All Museums Salary Transparency Spreadsheet that was inspired by the 2019 AAM conference. And I forget, I think we're up to over 800, maybe even 1,000 entries for this spreadsheet, which has this long link here, and I'll pop it in the chat. And so you can see different types of organizations, locations, job type, salary, year they started, etc. There's a lot of good raw information in here. And if you are looking at a particular area or looking for a particular institution type, because we know we're not all federal employees, we may be small nonprofit versus academia. And so you can get a sense of not only for your location, but also for the types of institutions in your location, but also nearby. So this is also another great way to take the information you may have found through the living wage calculator, through the government pay schedules, and get a real sense from just last year, which again, pre-COVID, so helpful, but maybe not 100% accurate anymore, but get a sense for what the institutions were paying, at least in 2019. Small break for tea. Okay, so this one is for archivists. Excuse me. So this one has been a bugaboo of mine. The Society of American Archivists, the most recent survey that they did started in 2004 with publications in 2006. And one of the recommendations in their write-ups was that the salary survey should be done more often. Did that happen? No. To be fair, they tried. They tried to get some grants to pay for it to do it, and they did get, I think, an IMLS grant this year to finally do another one. But one, they should be done more often, and two, this is something that, in my opinion, no matter what professional organization you are, this needs to be a part of the operating budget. This needs to be something that is funded by the profession to be done more frequently and perhaps have some sustainable mechanisms built in. Looking at you, COSA, the Council of State Archives, who do it every year. And granted, it's a little easier for them. They've got their state schedules to pull. Those numbers are already figured out, but it's up to the states to submit it to COSA, and COSA publishes it. So there's a model out there for those to be gathered every year. And I don't mean to pick on SAA. Everybody could really improve how they're doing this. But anyway, that is why this particular census is so old, almost 20 years old. However, I have had fun playing with it the last year or so because it's been interesting to compare the census from 2004, mostly data from 2004, to the impromptu salary survey, also of 2019 from the SAA annual conference. Very similar to the museum spreadsheet we just saw, and very helpful in the same ways that I just articulated in terms of type of university, location, and cost. Um, and when you look at the census data and you do the math in terms of, okay, so in 2004, $60,000 is actually this amount of dollars in 2019, we get into some sad and interesting data, which I'll get into in a moment. But just a side note to remember a census and remember how old it is, and then also know that you've got a more recent, if informal, archivist data from this very helpful bit.ly link they provided. And for librarians, so for the ALA website, so American Library Association, for their link, I just wanted to pull this headline because we'll continue this conversation. Their most recent survey that I found, and librarians, please correct me if this is not the most recent survey. I would be happy to share a more recent one if you know of it. But from what I found, the most recent survey appears to be from 2012. And what they found in this data gathering is that surveys were flat and in some cases lower than what they were before. And salary surveys for public historians, there was a beautiful pie chart I wanted to share with you, but unfortunately the data that was shared with me is still private. I do not have permission to share it with you. Public historians, if you have data that is shareable, please let me know. I'll be happy to share it with you. But for public historians, in conversations that I have had, it is a little harder than if you were an archivist or a librarian, for example, because there's what public history encompasses is larger and a bit amorphous. So while there is the historian's general schedule and there is firms like History Associates that we can look to, I have not been able to find a lot of publishable or shareable data to help you out. However, what is interesting is that over in Australia, there's a lot of interesting information. This particular one, this is I believe, very similar firm like History Associates, where they break down the level of historians. And then if you go check out their PDF, the very next page has their scale fees. This one, they just updated it for 2020. And so just do the conversions in terms of Australian dollars to US or Canada dollars, wherever you are. And that should at least help get you some numbers to start playing with. Okay, getting to salaries being flat or lower. For archivists and librarians, especially since we have been seeing this trend, I would not be surprised if this was also true for museum professionals and public historians. But in crunching the data, this is from the Salary Transparency, the Impromptu Informal Survey. I then started doing the math in terms of, okay, from the ACensus data, the national salary was 49,000-ish. And then to do the calculation at the time I was doing this, which was 2019, that equals 68,500. So dollars from 2003 equated into what it would have been in 2019 from the ACensus. Now, when looking at the 2019 Impromptu Salary Survey, the national average salary is $62,775, which is a 5,700 and such deficit, which is quite a lot when you are already only making the 60,000 a year. So this is not good. This is showing that not only are we flat, not increasing, we are actually going down in terms of what we were paid in 2003 is even less than what we're being paid now. And this was after recovery from 2008 and pre-COVID. So we don't even have like an economic disaster we could point to that would help explain this very concerning downward trend.